Fort Bowie shimmered under the Arizona sun like a mirage built from sand and spite. The cavalry unit moved through the canyon in practice formation, hooves striking stone in a rhythm that spoke of confidence and authority. Corporal Ethan Cross rode near the rear, his hand resting on the stock of his rifle, his eyes scanning the terrain with the automatic vigilance of a man who'd learned that survival depended on noticing what didn't belong. The air tasted of dust and something metallic he couldn't name, but recognized as trouble brewing. Colonel James Caldwell led from the front, his posture rigid with the certainty of a man who believed his orders came from God and country in equal measure. The Apache encampment appeared below them, nestled in a shallow valley where a seasonal creek had carved shelter from the unforgiving landscape. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played near the water's edge. An old woman hung strips of meat to dry in the sun. Caldwell raised his fist. The unit halted, his voice carried across the stillness with parade ground precision. "Dismount. Fix bayonets. We leave no witnesses." The words landed in Ethan's chest like stones dropping into a well. He looked at the scene below again, searching for the threat that would justify what he'd just heard. Warriors with weapons, fortifications, signs of hostile intent. He found none of these things. Only families going about the business of staying alive in a land that wanted them gone. Sergeant William Hooks moved among the men, checking weapons, his face carefully neutral in the way men learned when carrying out orders they didn't want to examine too closely. Ethan had served with Hooks for 3 years. They'd shared coffee and complaints and the peculiar intimacy of men who watched each other's backs when death came calling. Now Hooks wouldn't meet his eyes. The unit began its descent. Ethan's horse sensed his tension and sidestepped, forcing him to steady the animal with pressure from his knees. Around him, men checked cartridges and loosened sabers in their scabbards, with the mechanical efficiency of soldiers preparing for work they'd done before. His mouth had gone dry. His hands remained steady only through force of will. The old woman spotted them first. She dropped the meat and began calling out in Apache, her voice sharp with alarm. People scattered toward their homes. A man emerged with a rifle, saw the numbers arrayed against him, and lowered the weapon slowly to the ground before raising his hands. Children cried, dogs barked. The encampment erupted into chaos that looked nothing like resistance and everything like terror. Caldwell's voice cut through the confusion like a blade. "Fire at will!" The first shots cracked across the valley. Ethan saw the man with raised hands jerk backward, red blooming across his chest. The old woman tried to run. A bullet caught her between the shoulders and she fell forward into the dirt, her arms outstretched as if reaching for something that wasn't there anymore. Ethan lowered his rifle. The weight of it suddenly felt unbearable, as if the weapon itself had become complicit in something his hands refused to do. Around him, soldiers advanced into the encampment. More shots, screams that would echo in his sleep for years. The smell of gunpowder mixing with cooking smoke. Hooks appeared beside him, his face pale beneath the dust. "Cross, you need to engage." The words came out flat, empty, a man doing his duty because that's what men did. "Sir, these aren't hostiles. These are peaceful." "That's an order, Corporal." Ethan looked at the scene unfolding below. A soldier dragged a woman from a dwelling. Another set fire to a storage structure. Children huddled together near the creek, surrounded by bodies of those who'd tried to shield them. His finger rested on the trigger guard, refusing to move inside to where it could end another life in service of orders that had nothing to do with defense or justice, or any of the reasons he'd believed when he took his oath. He raised his voice over the gunfire. "No, sir." Hooks froze. Other soldiers nearby turned to stare. The word hung in the air between them like something physical and dangerous. "Corporal Cross, I'm ordering you to—" "I heard the order, Sergeant. My answer stands." Caldwell had noticed the commotion. He rode toward them, his face dark with fury that had nothing to do with battlefield necessity and everything to do with authority questioned. His horse snorted and tossed its head, picking up on the tension radiating from its rider. "You refusing a direct order, soldier?" Ethan met the colonel's eyes without flinching. Something in his chest had gone cold and clear, like ice forming over water. He understood that what he said next would define the rest of his life in ways he couldn't fully calculate yet. "Yes, sir, I am. These are savages, hostiles, Threats to American settlers. Sir, I see old men, women, and children. I don't see a threat. Caldwell's hand moved to his sidearm. For a moment, Ethan thought the colonel might shoot him there on the hillside. One more casualty in an operation that would be written up as a necessary action against hostile forces. Instead, Caldwell's voice dropped to something quieter and more venomous than shouting. Arrest this man. Court-martial charges for insubordination and cowardice in the face of the enemy. Hooks moved to comply, his movements mechanical, his eyes hollow. As hands gripped Ethan's arms and pulled him from his horse, he kept watching the valley below. The old woman's body lay where it had fallen. Her hand still reached toward something. The seasonal creek ran red with what it was never meant to carry. Before they dragged him away, she turned her head. Somehow still alive despite the wound that should have killed her. Her eyes found his across the distance. Her lips moved. He couldn't hear the words but felt them settle into his bones anyway. You, different, desert, remember. Then someone clubbed him with a rifle butt and the world went dark. 3 years swallowed the space between that day and this one. Ethan Cross rode along a trail beside a dry riverbed as sunset painted the Arizona territory in shades of amber and shadow. His horse moved with the patience of an animal accustomed to long rides, and a rider who spent more time in silence than conversation. Dust rose around them in small clouds that caught the dying light and turned it into something almost beautiful if you didn't think too hard about what the land demanded in exchange for its occasional grace. The supplies in his saddlebag represented 2 weeks of careful spending at the general store in town. Flour, coffee, cartridges for the rifle he maintained with military precision, despite no longer having any claim to that discipline. Salt pork wrapped in waxed paper, a new whetstone because the old one had finally worn too thin to keep his blade properly sharp. Everything he needed to sustain the solitary life he'd built from the ruins of the one taken from him. He wore civilian clothes now, but they hung on him with a neatness that betrayed habits formed by years of inspections and regulations. His shirt tucked in, his belt buckle centered. The scar along his jawline had faded from angry red to pale white. A memento from a guard who'd taken exception to something Ethan said during the weeks between his arrest and his dishonorable discharge. The paperwork had cited cowardice and dereliction of duty. The truth lived somewhere more complicated but no less damning. Daniel's grave lay 2 miles east of his property line, marked by a simple wooden cross that Ethan had carved himself and sunk deep enough to withstand the desert winds. He'd visited that morning before heading to town, standing in silence the way he did every week, speaking only at the end to say what needed saying, even though the person who needed to hear it could no longer answer. Army came through again, still looking for deserters who haven't been accounted for. I didn't tell them anything. They don't know about you. The words had fallen into the stillness around the grave like stones into a well. No echo returned, no absolution offered. Just the wind moving through the scrub brush and the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade sitting heavy across his shoulders. Daniel had been 23 when he died, young enough to still believe the world rewarded goodness, old enough to know his older brother carried burdens that no amount of talking could lighten. He'd shown up in the town where Ethan was hiding under a false name, working odd jobs for cash, sleeping in a room above a stable that smelled of horse sweat and hay. Military police had been asking questions. Someone had mentioned a man who moved like a soldier and kept to himself in ways that suggested he had reasons. Daniel had tried to argue, tried to convince Ethan to run further, hide better, or, the option Ethan had refused most firmly, turn himself in and face the consequences of standing by principles the Army considered treasonous. The argument had gone in circles until boots sounded on the stairs outside. Daniel had made his choice in the seconds it took for Ethan to realize what his brother intended. Go! Out the back! Now! Danny, come with me! Someone has to slow them down. The military police had burst through the door to find Daniel claiming to be Ethan Cross, matching the description closely enough in the chaos of the moment to create doubt. They'd arrested him. By the time they sorted out the truth 3 days later, Daniel was dead, shot while allegedly attempting escape from custody. Ethan had heard the official story from a sympathetic bartender who'd known both brothers. The real story remained buried with Daniel under a cross carved from wood that would eventually weather and fall. The horse's ears swiveled forward, breaking Ethan's spiral into memory. Something ahead had caught the animal's attention. He straightened in the saddle, his right hand moving automatically to rest on the holster at his hip. Not drawing, not threatening, just ready in case readiness mattered. The buzzards circled first, their shadows wheeling across the sandy ground in patterns that spoke of death waiting below. Ethan's jaw tightened. Could be an animal. A deer taken down by wolves and partially consumed. A wild dog dead from drinking contaminated water. The desert killed things regularly, and the carrion birds served their purpose in the endless cycle of everything consuming everything else. But the shape near the clay bank looked wrong for an animal. Too angular, too deliberately positioned as if someone had crawled there seeking shelter before strength failed entirely. His horse slowed without being asked, trained by experience to recognize when caution mattered more than speed. Ethan dismounted, boots hitting the ground with a sound that seemed too loud in the stillness. He approached the shape with his hand hovering near his revolver, not from expectation of threat, but from the habit of a man who'd learned that assumptions killed people faster than bullets. The details resolved as he closed the distance. A woman collapsed on her side. Breathing shallow enough that he had to watch carefully to confirm her chest still rose and fell. She was tall, taller than most women he'd known. Long legs folded beneath her, arms scraped raw from what looked like a desperate flight through brush and over rocks. Her deerskin dress had been torn heavily at the shoulder and down across the ribs, the edges ragged as if someone had gripped the material and pulled. Dried blood marked the exposed skin along her collarbone. More blood crusted in her hair, which hung in tangled strands mixed with loose feathers and broken leather ties. Apache. The realization settled over him with the weight of unfinished business and debts that couldn't be repaid. He crouched beside her, close enough to see the bruises darkening her cheekbone, the swelling around her left eye, the defensive wounds on her forearms where she'd tried to ward off whoever had done this. His pulse kicked up, not from fear but from anger that arrived cold and focused the way it always did when he encountered evidence of cruelty presented as something justified or necessary. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. Brown eyes appeared in the narrow space between barely opened lids, focused despite the weakness of her body. She didn't speak. She watched him instead, taking in his face, his posture, his hands. Calculating whether he represented another threat or something different, he recognized that wariness, had worn it himself in the months after everything fell apart, when every person who tried to help felt dangerous because help always came with prices hidden in the fine print. He kept his hands where she could see them, making no move toward her, letting her make the assessment at her own pace. "You're hurt. I'm not going to touch you unless you let me." Her fingers moved slightly against the dirt. Not much. Barely anything. But enough to show she understood, and enough to give him the permission he wouldn't proceed without. He exhaled slowly and did the mental calculations. She couldn't walk. Dehydration had set in based on how dry her lips looked. The shoulder wound wasn't immediately fatal, but infection would be if she stayed out here. Night was coming, and with it temperatures that would drop enough to kill someone weakened and exposed. He made the decision the same way he'd made the one at Fort Bowie, quickly, quietly. Knowing it would complicate his carefully maintained isolation, but unable to choose differently, because some things mattered more than safety or convenience, or the simple life he'd built as penance for sins that weren't entirely his own. Ethan slid one arm under her shoulders and the other beneath her knees, lifting carefully while watching her face for signs of pain beyond what was unavoidable. She flinched when he first moved her, but didn't cry out. Her head came to rest against his chest without intention, her breath warm but uneven through the fabric of his shirt. He could feel her heart beating, faster than it should be, working too hard to keep blood moving through a body that had already given too much. He carried her to his horse and managed to mount while holding her secure against him. The animal shifted beneath the extra weight but settled when Ethan spoke low words of reassurance. Her head leaned against his shoulder, her hair brushing his jaw. He steadied her with one arm while guiding the horse with his free hand. setting a pace slow enough not to jostle her worse than necessary, but fast enough to get them to shelter before full darkness arrived. During the ride, he studied the land they passed through, reading the story written in disturbed brush and drag marks in the dirt. She'd come from the north where raiders had been rumored to be operating, not random thieves looking for easy targets, organized men with purpose behind their violence. He felt anger flicker beneath his ribs, not at her, but at whoever had left her broken in the desert, like refuse to be consumed by scavengers. His cabin appeared as the last light faded, small and sturdy against the emptiness surrounding it. He'd built it himself over the course of 2 months, working until his hands bled and his back screamed, needing the physical labor to exhaust him enough that sleep came without dreams. The structure sat low and practical, designed to survive storms rather than impress visitors. A single window faced east to catch morning light. The door hung straight on leather hinges he'd crafted after the metal ones rusted through. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, laying her on his bed, the only bed in the single-room dwelling. She tried to sit up immediately, some instinct against vulnerability overriding the exhaustion that had claimed her. Pain forced her back down, her breathing hitching with the effort. Ethan knelt beside the bed, his movements deliberate and slow, giving her time to track what he was doing and raise objection if needed. He had warm water on the stove from earlier. He poured it into a basin and brought it to the bedside, along with clean cloths and the bottle of whiskey he kept for occasions, requiring disinfection or fortitude or both. "I'm going to clean your shoulder wound first. It's going to hurt." She watched his face instead of his hands, searching for something he couldn't name but hoped she'd find. He dipped the cloth in warm water and began cleaning away the dried blood crusted around the injury. She winced but didn't pull away. Her chest rose sharply when he touched the torn edge of her dress, where it exposed the scrape along her collarbone. He paused, meeting her eyes, giving her the chance to refuse. When she didn't, he continued working with the clinical detachment he'd learned during his years in uniform, when tending wounded men meant focusing on the damage rather than the person suffering it. Her eyes stayed on his face, tracking every movement, waiting for the moment his gaze would shift to something predatory or possessive. The moment never came. He kept his attention on the wounds, cleaning methodically, his expression neutral except for the tightness around his jaw that spoke of anger directed elsewhere. When he finally draped a blanket across her, covering what her ruined dress no longer could, her hand moved, slowly, hesitantly. Her fingertips touched the sleeve of his shirt just above his wrist. Not gripping, not grasping, just making contact in a way that acknowledged something passing between them that neither had words for yet. He settled into the chair beside the bed, his posture stiff from tension held too long, his mind racing through questions without answers. Who was she? What had happened? Would whoever hurt her come looking? The silence stretched between them, broken only by the small sounds of her breathing and the wind testing the walls outside. She whispered something then, her voice rough and low, shaped by a language he didn't speak. He leaned closer and she repeated it, the words scraping against exhaustion. Nayeli. Her name. He nodded slowly. Ethan. Ethan Cross. Her eyes held his for a moment longer, something shifting in her expression that might have been the beginning of trust or might have been simple acceptance that she had no choice but to believe him for now. Then her eyelids grew heavy and her body eased into the kind of sleep that came from absolute depletion. Ethan remained in the chair long after she'd surrendered to unconsciousness, listening to her breathe, counting the intervals between inhalations to make sure they stayed steady. The cabin creaked around them as the temperature dropped. Somewhere outside, a coyote called to others of its kind and received answers that echoed across the empty spaces where humans rarely ventured, and survival depended on understanding which sounds meant danger approaching. He'd lived with solitude for 3 years, had constructed his days around routines that required no one else. Fix fences, tend the 2 horses he'd acquired through trade and saved wages, ride to town twice monthly for supplies, return before dark, keep his head down and his past buried and his future narrow enough that it couldn't betray him the way broader ambitions had. Now he sat watching a stranger sleep in his bed, while knowing his careful isolation had already shattered the moment he lifted her from the dirt. Whoever had hurt her might come. The town might ask questions. His past might surface through the attention her presence would bring. None of that stopped him. Some things mattered more than safety. He'd learned that at Fort Bowie. Forgotten it cost him Daniel. Couldn't afford to forget again. Morning arrived in a pale strip of light that pushed through the eastern window and settled across the floorboards with the gentleness of something hesitant to disturb what it found. Ethan was already awake, having dozed in broken intervals throughout the night, his body trained by years of military watches to function on minimal rest. His back ached from the position. His neck had stiffened. He straightened slowly, joints protesting, and stood to light the fire in the stove. The familiar routine calmed the anxiety that wanted to build in his chest. Fill the firebox, strike the match. Wait for the kindling to catch. Add larger pieces once the flames establish themselves. Pour water into the battered pot he'd been using for 5 years. Measure coffee grounds by feel, since measuring spoons felt like unnecessary luxury for a man living alone. Niley stirred as the smell of brewing coffee filled the small space. She opened her eyes, and for a moment confusion crossed her face as she tried to place where she was and how she'd arrived there. Her gaze found him standing by the stove, and sharpness returned to her expression, the wariness of someone remembering she'd woken in the home of a stranger, regardless of how she'd gotten there. She pushed herself upright using her good arm, the injured shoulder protesting based on how her jaw clenched against obvious pain. Her hand braced against the bed frame, fingers curling tightly around the wood as she fought to sit without crying out. Ethan moved toward her but stopped several feet away, letting her choose whether she wanted help or preferred to manage on her own. She lifted her eyes to him, exhausted, guarded, calculating. Something passed between them in the silence before she gave a small nod. Permission granted. He crossed the remaining distance and slid one hand behind her back for support. Her muscles tensed at the contact. Reflexive rather than fearful, her body remembering violence and responding with automatic defense. When she realized he wasn't restraining her or forcing anything, the tension eased fractionally. She let him help her sit fully upright, her breathing growing rough from the effort. She pressed a hand to her ribs and grimaced. "You should rest a little longer." His voice came out quieter than he'd intended, careful not to sound like a command or demand. She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her words carried weight despite being barely above a whisper. "I do." He accepted that. Everyone had their own relationship with pain and their own reasons for pushing through it rather than surrendering to rest. He handed her the tin cup of water he'd prepared earlier, cooled enough not to burn, but still warm enough to soothe. She took it with both hands, her fingers trembling slightly from weakness rather than fear. She lifted it to her lips and drank in small sips, some of the liquid escaping to run down her chin. She kept trying. Ethan watched her carefully, noting the strength that persisted beneath the exhaustion. She had the bearing of someone accustomed to hardship, someone who'd been taught to endure and overcome rather than collapse and wait for rescue. The warrior scars on her forearms, thin white lines from old cuts that had healed cleanly, told part of that story. The rest would come when she was ready to share it or not at all if she chose silence. She set the cup aside and tried to stand, pushing against the bed with her good arm, determination overriding practical limitations. Ethan reached out instinctively to steady her, but she raised her hand between them, not refusing help entirely, but claiming the right to try first on her own terms. He respected that and held his position, close enough to catch her if she fell, but far enough to give her the dignity of the attempt. She made it to her feet. Her legs shook from bearing weight they weren't ready to support. She took one careful step, then another, moving toward the table with single-minded focus. On the third step, pain shot up her side, and her balance failed. Her hands shot out, not toward the table, but toward him, fingers closing over the fabric of his shirt at chest height, gripping tightly enough that he felt her knuckles press against his ribs. He caught her waist before she could collapse, his other hand coming up automatically to support her back. Her body leaned into him, her weight slight despite her height, her forehead brushing against his collarbone. He could feel her breath warm through the thin cotton of his shirt, could feel the rapid beat of her heart where her chest pressed against his, could smell the wood smoke and dessert dust in her hair, mixed with copper from dried blood. His own heartbeat jolted at the sudden closeness. Not attraction exactly, though he registered somewhere distant that she was striking in ways that had nothing to do with conventional beauty and everything to do with the fierce dignity she maintained even while injured. More than that, he felt the profound responsibility of her vulnerability, the weight of being the person between her and further harm. Niley lifted her head, her breathing hard, their faces close enough that he could see the tiny flecks of amber in her dark eyes. She studied him with an intensity that felt like being measured against standards he couldn't name but desperately wanted to meet. Looking for threat, looking for judgment, looking for the selfish intent most men carried even when pretending otherwise. She found none of those things. Her expression shifted, something easing in the set of her shoulders, even as her grip on his shirt remained firm. He cleared his throat softly and helped guide her the remaining distance to the table, supporting her weight while letting her maintain as much independence as her condition allowed. She lowered herself into the chair with visible effort, her breathing controlled now, slower and more deliberate as she fought to regain composure. Ethan placed food in front of her. Bread he'd baked 3 days prior, still edible if you didn't mind the texture. Beans warmed on the stove, a small piece of dried meat from his dwindling supplies. Not much, but everything he had available until his next trip to town. She paused before eating, her hand hovering over the bread, her eyes moving from the food to his face and back again. He recognized the hesitation after a moment. Trust wasn't free. Some people poisoned those they claimed to help. Others fed themselves first while the weak starved. She was watching for his intentions the same way she'd watched his face while he cleaned her wounds. Ethan tore a piece of bread and ate it himself. Only then did she begin eating, her movements careful and measured despite obvious hunger that made her hands shake. She didn't rush, didn't grab. Maintained control even while her body demanded she consume everything within reach. While she ate, Ethan stepped outside to check the horses and scan the surrounding area for signs of visitors he didn't want. The morning air carried the crispness that preceded true heat, that brief window where the desert felt almost welcoming before the sun reminded you why only the stubborn or desperate chose to live here. He looked toward the hills, uneasy prickling at the base of his skull. The feeling from yesterday, the sense of being watched on the road into town, returned with renewed force. When he came back inside, Nayeli was attempting to walk again, moving slowly along the wall with her fingertips trailing across the rough wood for guidance. She had the single-minded determination of someone who refused to accept weakness as permanent. He approached carefully, ready to help but aware she needed to test herself without interference. She took 2 unsteady steps before her knees buckled. He reached her before she hit the floor, his hands catching her arms, steadying her while she fought to remain upright. Her hand landed on his chest again, this time her fingers curling lightly over the muscle beneath his shirt, her palm pressed above where his heart beat faster than it should. Her breathing trembled, but not from fear. From frustration, maybe, or simple exhaustion, or the overwhelming reality of how close she'd come to dying alone in the desert. This time she didn't pull away immediately. This time she stayed against him for several seconds, gathering strength, accepting support she'd probably never asked for and rarely received. Ethan steadied his own breathing, acutely aware of every point where her body made contact with his, feeling her heartbeat through the places they touched. She smelled of smoke and earth and something underneath that was purely her. Something he couldn't name, but recognized as the essence that remained when everything else was stripped away. Her eyes lifted to his again, studying the scar along his jaw, the steadiness in his gaze, the absence of demands or expectations in his expression. She mouthed a word then, quiet and uncertain, her voice barely carrying the distance between them. "Thank you." The roughness of her voice scraped against something in his chest. He nodded once, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in his throat. He helped her back to the bed, supporting her weight completely now that she'd exhausted what little strength she'd hoarded. Before he could step away, she caught his sleeve, her grip light but definite. Not fear driving the gesture, not helplessness. Something else. The need for proximity, the desire not to be alone. He pulled the chair closer and sat, positioning himself where she could see him without straining. She lay back against the pillow, her eyes still open, still watching him, fighting sleep as if afraid he might disappear the moment she stopped maintaining vigilance. "It's all right. Rest. I'm not going anywhere." Her breathing steadied at that, the rhythm evening out as her body finally accepted what her mind had been resisting. Slowly her eyes closed. Her hand remained near the edge of the blanket closest to him, fingers curled slightly as if holding something invisible. Ethan watched her carefully, cataloging every bruise, every scrape, every torn seam in her dress. The story they told was clear enough. Someone had tried to hurt her badly. Someone had chased her far enough that she'd collapsed from exhaustion rather than being caught. And if they had chased her this far, they might come again. The anger that had flickered earlier settled into something colder and more permanent in his chest. A mix of protective instinct and fury directed at people he hadn't met but already hated for what they'd done. He didn't regret bringing her here. The complications didn't matter weight against leaving her to die, but he felt the weight of what came next pressing down on his shoulders alongside all the other weights he carried. Wind pushed against the cabin walls as afternoon arrived. Ethan stepped outside again to gather water from the well, his eyes scanning the horizon every few seconds out of habit and necessity. No riders appeared. No smoke rose in the distance. No dust clouds betrayed approaching horses. The emptiness should have been reassuring. Instead, it felt like the stillness before something broke. Inside, Nayli slept with the depth of someone whose body had finally overridden consciousness to claim the rest it needed for healing. Ethan stood in the doorway watching her, then moved to prepare broth from the dried meat and some herbs he kept for occasions when his own appetite failed. Simple food, but it would give her body something to work with when she woke. The afternoon passed in silence, broken only by small sounds. The fire crackling, water boiling, his footsteps crossing the floor to check on her breathing steady and deep. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying sand that hissed against the walls like whispered warnings about futures that hadn't arrived yet, but were coming regardless. As sunset approached, Nayeli stirred again, her eyes opening more easily this time, her body less rigid with the wariness that had dominated earlier. She pushed herself to sitting with less obvious pain, the rest having done its work even if full healing remained far off. Ethan brought her the broth, and she accepted it with both hands, sipping slowly, her eyes never leaving his face. "You slept most of the day. Your fever's down. That's good." She lowered the cup and traced a finger along the blanket's edge, her movements thoughtful and measured. When she spoke, her voice came out softer than before, not weak but gentled somehow. "Safe here." Two words that carried weight beyond their simplicity. A question and a statement simultaneously, seeking confirmation and offering observation. He met her eyes without looking away. "Yes, nobody's going to hurt you." She held his gaze, trying to judge whether she could trust those words or if they were just sounds men made to get what they wanted. Eventually, her shoulders eased fractionally, belief arriving not all at once, but in small increments that might grow into something more solid. She tried to stand again. Ethan moved to help, and this time she accepted without hesitation, taking his offered arm, using his strength to supplement her own. She placed her feet on the floor and steadied herself before pushing upright, her legs shaking but holding. She gripped the table edge and breathed slowly, trying to settle the exhaustion that pressed against every movement. The torn dress remained a problem, pulling at her bruised ribs whenever she lifted her arms, the neckline slipping enough to expose skin she clearly wanted covered. Her attempts to manage the blanket while walking failed repeatedly, the fabric falling whenever she needed both hands for balance. Ethan grabbed one of his clean shirts from the shelf beside his bed and held it out without explanation or expectation. "Here, might be easier." Niley looked at the shirt, then at him. He didn't push, didn't turn away to give false privacy in a single-room cabin, just held it steady and let her decide. After several seconds, she reached for it, holding the fabric against herself as she moved to the corner behind where his coat hung from a peg. He turned toward the window, fixing his eyes on the pale stretch of desert visible through the glass, keeping them there until he heard her soft call indicating she'd finished. When she emerged, the shirt hung loosely on her frame, the shoulders too broad and the sleeves too long even after she'd rolled them to her elbows. But it covered her properly and gave back some of the dignity she'd been trying to hold on to since waking. She stood in the center of the cabin, looking uncertain about what to do next. Her height and strength were evident, even diminished by injury. She carried herself like someone accustomed to action rather than passivity, someone who led rather than followed, someone for whom accepting help represented a temporary concession rather than permanent state. You need rest. She shook her head, the gesture small but definite. Move. I need move. He understood. Some people healed by lying still. Others needed to feel their bodies working, needed to prove to themselves they hadn't been broken beyond repair. Movement grounded them even when it hurt, especially when it hurt. All right, slow steps, stay near the wall. She nodded, her jaw tight with determination that suggested she'd push through pain rather than acknowledge limitations. She walked the length of the room, her fingertips dragging along the wood for support, each step testing limits her body wasn't ready to meet. Her breath caught, her shoulders stiffened, but she didn't stop. After a few minutes, her legs began failing in earnest. She reached out quickly and Ethan caught her arm before she fell, his other hand bracing her back. She leaned heavily into him, her height matching his so closely that her forehead touched his cheekbone when she sagged against his support. Her breath came warm and uneven against his skin, but not panicked, not fearful, just the ragged breathing of someone who'd pushed too hard and knew it. Ethan steadied his stance, taking her weight while giving her time to recover without forcing her to acknowledge the weakness aloud. You're pushing too hard. She didn't answer with words, simply stayed against him, drawing from his strength until she could find her own again. Then her hand moved, slow and uncertain, coming to rest on his chest. Her palm pressed over his shirt directly above where his heart beat steady and strong. She seemed to be checking something, his reliability, his intentions, the warmth beneath her hand that confirmed he was real and present and meant what he'd promised. Her fingers curled slightly, gripping the fabric the way she had earlier, holding on to something tangible while everything else remained uncertain. You helped me. No man helped before. The statement landed with the force of lived experience behind it, a history of men who'd hurt rather than helped, who'd taken rather than given, who'd used her strength against her or tried to break it entirely. He didn't know how to respond to that weight, didn't want to offer empty reassurances that meant nothing against the evidence her life had provided. So he gave her the one thing he was certain of, the only truth he could guarantee. You were alone out there. I saw you. I wasn't going to leave you. She looked at him as though weighing his words against every other word men had spoken to her over the years. Slowly, the tension in her shoulders eased. She allowed him to guide her back to the bed, his movements careful, his support unwavering. Once seated, she surprised him by reaching up. Her fingers brushed his jawline, tracing the scar near his chin with deliberate attention. The touch was exploratory rather than intimate, her way of trying to understand him through physical evidence, the same way he'd been trying to understand her. She studied his face while her fingertips mapped the old injury, her eyes searching for something in his expression that would tell her whether the scar came from honorable conflict or shameful causes. Ethan froze, unprepared for the gesture, unprepared for how it made him acutely aware of every point where her skin met his. She was deciding something, making an assessment that mattered in ways he couldn't fully grasp yet. The lantern light softened her features, but he could see the strength there clearly now. Not just physical strength, though that was evident. Something deeper, a core of determination that pain and cruelty hadn't managed to erode. Her hand lowered, but the moment stayed, hovering between them like something that would need addressing eventually, but not yet. Not while everything remained too raw and uncertain. Ethan cleared his throat, breaking the silence that had stretched too long. I'll make more broth. She nodded, her eyes tracking him as he moved to the stove. Then she spoke quietly, the words carrying across the small space with unexpected weight. Thank you, Ethan. Hearing his name in her voice pulled something loose in his chest, a tightness he'd been carrying for 3 years that suddenly shifted, not disappearing, but changing shape into something he could bear differently. He turned away before the feelings showed on his face in ways he wasn't ready to name or acknowledge. As evening settled over the desert and shadows claimed the spaces between things, they existed together in the cabin that had been built for one person's isolation. Two people who'd been shattered in different ways, learning to occupy the same space without knowing yet what that meant or where it led. The fire cast dancing light across walls that had known only stillness for too long. Outside, the wind carried sounds that might have been coyotes or might have been something else approaching across the darkness where sight failed and instinct took over. Ethan sat by the bed as Niallie's breathing deepened into sleep. His rifle leaned against the wall within easy reach. His senses stretched toward the world beyond the cabin's protection, listening for the sounds that would warn of trouble before it arrived. The desert had brought her to him. The desert might try to take her back. He'd already decided which side of that conflict he stood on, even knowing it might cost him everything he'd spent 3 years building in this careful isolation. Some things mattered more than safety. Some people deserved someone to stand watch while they slept. He'd learned that lesson too late to save Daniel. He wouldn't be too late this time. Whatever came next, whatever complications followed from the choice to help her, he'd face them the same way he'd faced Caldwell all those years ago, by standing his ground and refusing to look away from what needed doing, regardless of what it cost. The night deepened. The stars emerged in quantities that only the desert could offer. Inside the small cabin, two lives that had been running parallel in isolation began the slow work of intersection, neither knowing yet what would grow from that meeting, but both sensing they'd passed some point where turning back ceased being an option either would choose. Morning arrived with light that seemed hesitant to commit, the sun casting uncertain shadows across the cabin floor. Niallie woke before Ethan finished checking the perimeter outside, her body responding to routines built from years of survival rather than the rest it still desperately needed. When he returned inside, she was attempting to stand, using the bed frame for leverage, her jaw set against pain that showed in every line of her body. He moved to help without speaking, offering his arm. She took it with less hesitation than the day before, learning that accepting support didn't equal surrender. Together they managed the few steps to the table where he'd set out weak tea and softened bread. She ate slowly, her eyes tracking his movements as he tended the fire, checking weapons with the automatic precision of someone for whom readiness had become reflex rather than choice. "You were soldier." Not a question. An observation stated with certainty that came from recognizing patterns others might miss. He paused in his examination of the rifle's action, then continued working while he answered. "I was. Why you stop?" The question hung between them, simple in phrasing, but complex in what it asked him to reveal. He set the rifle aside and met her eyes, seeing genuine curiosity rather than judgment there. "I refused an order. They discharged me for it." She absorbed this, her expression thoughtful. "Order to do what?" He told her then, the words coming easier than expected, because she listened without interrupting or offering opinions on choices already made and consequences already suffered. He described Fort Bowie, the peaceful encampment, Caldwell's command, his refusal, the massacre that happened anyway while he stood arrested and helpless, the court-martial, the dishonorable discharge that followed him like a shadow he couldn't escape. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke with the weight of someone who understood exactly what he was confessing. "My aunt died there." The statement landed like a physical blow. Ethan's breath caught, his hands stilled completely. She continued, her voice steady despite addressing pain 3 years old, but never fully healed. "Fort Apache, 1875. She was hanging meat when soldiers came. She called warning. They shot her anyway." He wanted to apologize, but the words felt inadequate against the magnitude of what had been taken from her people, what he'd failed to prevent despite trying. She seemed to sense this struggle because her next words shifted the ground beneath them. "You try to stop it. Most soldiers just kill. You different." "Not different enough. She still died." "Yes, but you refused orders. You lost everything for refusing. That matters." Her hand reached across the table, not quite touching his, but close enough that he felt the heat radiating from her skin. The gesture acknowledged something passing between them, a recognition that they'd both been damaged by the same events from opposite sides, and somehow ended up here seeking different forms of redemption. The moment broke when hoofbeats sounded outside, multiple horses approaching at measured pace. Ethan rose immediately, his hand moving to the rifle. Niallie tried to stand, but he gestured for her to stay, positioning himself between her and the door. Through the window he saw 3 riders, their silhouettes resolving into details as they drew closer. The lead rider dismounted with deliberate slowness, his movements carrying authority that needed no announcement. Age had weathered his face into something that looked carved from the same stone as the mountains behind him. Beadwork decorated his buckskin shirt. A necklace of bone pieces rested against his chest. His eyes held the sharpness of someone who saw through surfaces to what lived underneath. Behind him, two younger warriors sat their horses with the stillness of men comfortable with violence, but disciplined enough to withhold it until necessary. The younger one, barely 20, watched everything with hungry attention. The older warrior's face bore scars that spoke of battles survived and lessons learned through pain. Ethan stepped onto the porch, keeping his hands visible, his posture non-threatening, but not submissive. The old man raised an open hand in the Apache gesture of peace. Ethan returned it. "Can I help you?" "We follow tracks 2 days. Find blood, find signs of struggle. Thought she died." His English carried the formal precision of someone who'd learned the language through necessity rather than choice. His eyes moved past Ethan to the cabin's interior, where Nayeli had appeared in the doorway, despite his silent request that she remain hidden. "She was alive when I found her. Barely." The old man studied Ethan with an intensity that felt like being assessed for worth and finding the scales uncomfortably balanced. His gaze took in the military bearing Ethan couldn't fully suppress, the defensive positioning, the rifle within easy reach. "You are cavalry." The words carried accusation and inquiry simultaneously. Ethan straightened, meeting those sharp eyes without flinching. "I was." "Why you have my daughter?" The revelation shifted everything. Not just any Apache woman, the chief's daughter. The stakes had just multiplied beyond what he'd calculated when lifting her from the desert floor. Ethan chose his words carefully, aware that anything less than complete honesty would be detected and judged harshly. "I found her collapsed near the dry riverbed. She was dying. I helped her because it was right. Many men save women for bad reasons." Before Ethan could respond, Nayeli stepped forward. She spoke in Apache, her voice carrying strength despite her weakened condition, addressing the old man with respect but without deference. She gestured toward Ethan multiple times during her explanation. The old man's expression remained neutral throughout, giving nothing away. When she finished, he turned his attention back to Ethan, circling slowly, studying him with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned that small details revealed character more reliably than grand gestures. "I know you." Ethan tensed. The old man continued, his voice carrying certainty. "Fort Apache, 1875. You were there." "Yes." "You did not shoot." The words weren't accusation. They were statement of witnessed fact. Ethan struggled to understand how this man could know that detail from an event 3 years past. "I was in Hills with hunting party. We watched. Could not help. Too many soldiers. But we saw you refuse. Saw them arrest you." He stopped circling and faced Ethan directly. "My wife saw this before she died. The woman you saw reaching. She told me, white soldier refused orders. She said, that one is different." The weight of that connection settled over Ethan like something physical. The dying woman's words at Fort Bowie had been for her husband, a message he'd unwittingly carried for 3 years without knowing. "I'm sorry I couldn't stop it. I should have." The chief raised his hand, silencing him. "You refused order. You were punished. You lost rank and honor for refusing. My wife saw this. She said, 'Desert will remember.'" He paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "I am Chief Dakota. This is my daughter Nayeli. Because you tried to protect my people then, because you protected my daughter now, I owe you chance." Something in how he said chance suggested complications were coming. Dakota's next words confirmed this suspicion. "By our law, a man who saves Chief's daughter must be offered place beside her, as protector, as partner. This is great honor." Ethan felt Nayeli's attention sharpen behind him. Dakota wasn't finished. "But chance must be earned. Trust is not given freely when history teaches suspicion." He gestured toward the younger warriors. "You will prove yourself. 7 days. You keep her safe from those who hunt her. You prove honor remains when tested. After 7 days, if you succeed, and she still chooses, bond will be honored." The older warrior with scars spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the roughness of damage to his throat. Raiders who took her were not random thieves. They had training, military weapons. They spoke of Colonel who hired them. Ethan's gut clenched. Only one colonel he knew would do something like this. Dakota saw his reaction. You know who? James Caldwell. He was my commanding officer. The one who gave orders at massacre? Yes. Then you understand. This is personal for him. He comes not just for land or leverage. He comes for revenge against man who refused him, against people who survived him. Dakota moved closer, his voice dropping but losing none of its intensity. 7 days. Keep my daughter safe. Prove you can protect what you claim to value. Then we speak of future. He turned to leave but paused, looking back. The raiders were hired to take her alive. Someone wants leverage against our people. She is not safe until that someone is stopped. The 3 riders departed, leaving supplies near the porch as gesture of goodwill. As they disappeared into the distance, Ethan became aware of Nayeli standing close behind him. Her voice came quietly. My father is careful, man. He tests everyone. I understand. He's protecting you. You are angry? He turned to face her, surprised by the question. No, I'm determined. Something shifted in her expression, a reassessment happening in real time. She studied his face with the same intensity her father had shown, searching for cracks in his resolve or hidden motives beneath his words. Finding neither seemed to satisfy something in her. 7 days, I already know my choice, but custom demands respect. You understand? I understand. She moved back inside, leaving him to process the new parameters that had just defined his immediate future. 7 days to prove he could protect her against men with training and resources, while he had isolation and determination. 7 days while the woman he'd saved decided whether the bond forming between them was worth acknowledging in front of her, people and his God. The afternoon passed in establishing new patterns. Nayeli insisted on learning his defensive preparations despite her injuries. He showed her sight lines from the cabin, positions offering cover, the signals he'd use if trouble approached. She critiqued with the confidence of someone who'd been trained in tactics, pointing out weaknesses in his planning and suggesting improvements. You think like cavalry, rigid lines, direct approach. And you think like? Apache. We move like water, find weakness, strike where unexpected. She demonstrated despite his protests about her reopened shoulder wound, moving through the cabin and yard with fluid efficiency that made his military training look clumsy by comparison. Even injured, she carried the grace of someone completely comfortable in her body and certain of its capabilities. Teach me. The request surprised her. She tilted her head, studying him. Why? You know soldier ways. Because your way kept you alive when soldier way would have gotten you killed. I want to learn. Something in her expression softened at that admission. She began teaching him, showing him how to read land not as terrain to be crossed, but as living entity with rhythms and patterns, how to move without disturbing the environment's natural flow, how to become part of the landscape rather than intruder upon it. They worked through the afternoon, her strength returning incrementally with each hour that passed. When she finally needed rest, she settled onto the porch rather than returning to bed, her need to remain aware trumping her body's demands for continued healing. The older warrior with scars, Kimi, she told him, returned near sunset with additional supplies and a message from Dakota. He would remain nearby but not interfere. This was Ethan's test to pass or fail on his own merits. Kim lingered after delivering his message, studying Ethan with open curiosity. Why you live alone out here? The question carried no judgment, just genuine interest. Ethan considered deflecting, but decided honesty served him better. Personal reasons. Running from something or towards something. Both, maybe. Mostly trying to figure out which direction matters more. Kemi nodded as if that made perfect sense. I know about Daniel Cross. Ethan froze. Keem continued before he could formulate response. Your brother came through our territory 2 years before he died. Lost, injured. We helped him. He stayed 3 days. Learned from us. Spoke of his brother who carried too much weight. The revelation staggered him. Daniel had never mentioned that encounter. Never told him he'd connected with the Apache people Ethan had tried to protect. He asked us to watch for you if you ever came this way. Said you were a good man who needed reminded of that sometimes. Kem's voice gentled slightly. Your brother worried about you even then. He knew you struggled. He tried to set up support before he died. The knowledge hit Ethan harder than expected. Daniel had been planning for his future, building networks of care, believing his older brother was worth saving even when Ethan himself had stopped believing it. The weight of that gift pressed against his chest until breathing required conscious effort. He didn't blame you. Whatever guilt you carry, he didn't share it. Kem left after that, his words hanging in the air, like something Ethan would need to unpack slowly over time. He sat on the porch beside Niley as darkness claimed the desert. Neither speaking, both processing revelations that had reshaped their understanding of how they'd arrived at this moment. She broke the silence first. Your brother sounds like he was a good man. He was. Better than me. You cannot know that. Good is not competition. It's just choice made over and over. Her hand found his on the weathered wood between them. Not gripping, not demanding, just resting there, warm and solid and present. He turned his palm up and her fingers settled into it naturally, the contact feeling both new and ancient simultaneously. They sat that way as stars emerged in quantities that only the desert could offer. Two people who'd been shattered by the same violence, learning that broken pieces sometimes fit together in unexpected ways. Inside the cabin, his rifle waited. Outside in the darkness, raiders might be planning their next approach. 7 days stretched ahead, filled with tests and dangers and decisions that would define futures neither could fully predict. But for this moment, they held hands on a porch while the desert breathed around them, and that was enough. The third day arrived with tension that had nothing to do with approaching danger and everything to do with the bond forming faster than either had expected or particularly wanted. Niley moved through the cabin with increasing confidence, her body remembering its strength, her injuries healing at rates that impressed and concerned Ethan in equal measure. She pushed herself relentlessly, walking the property, practicing movements, refusing rest when her body clearly needed more. They'd fallen into patterns that felt domestic in ways that made him uncomfortable because comfort implied permanence, and permanence felt dangerous to hope for. She made coffee the way she'd learned by watching him. He cleaned her bandages with the gentleness she'd stopped flinching from. They worked side by side preparing meals, their movements synchronized without conscious planning. At night, they maintained respectful distance. She took the bed. He kept the chair. But sometimes he'd wake to find her watching him, or she'd stir to discover him checking her breathing. Neither acknowledged these small violations of sleep privacy. Neither pulled away. The fourth day brought their first real argument. She wanted to scout the surrounding area for signs of raiders. He refused to let her go alone. She insisted she'd been doing this longer than he'd been alive. He countered that her father had given him responsibility for her safety. Her eyes flashed with anger that transformed her face into something fierce and magnificent. I am not child needing protection. I am warrior. I have killed men in battle. I have led raids against cavalry. You forget this? I forget nothing. But you're still healing, and going out alone when we know they're hunting you is stupid, regardless of how skilled you are. Stupid? The word hung between them, a challenge neither was willing to back down from. They stood close enough that he could see the rapid pulse in her throat, could feel the heat radiating from her body, could smell the combination of sage and smoke that clung to her hair. Her hand had moved to the knife at her belt without conscious decision. His weight had shifted automatically into defensive stance. For several heartbeats, they existed in that charged space where violence and something else entirely lived side by side. Both possible, both tempting in different ways. Then she laughed. Not mockery, genuine amusement at the absurdity of them squaring off like opponents when they'd been allies since the moment he lifted her from the dirt. You are stubborn. So are you. Yes, this will be problem. Probably. Her hand relaxed away from the knife. His posture eased out of ready position. But neither stepped back, caught in proximity that felt charged with something neither wanted to name yet. We scout together then. You teach me cavalry way of seeing. I teach you Apache way. Maybe together we see everything. The compromise satisfied them both, and more importantly, gave them excuse to spend hours walking the property together. Her showing him how to track signs he'd never learned to read, him teaching her military tactics she'd only encountered as enemy on the other side. They worked well together, their different training creating synthesis stronger than either approach alone. Near sunset of the fourth day, a single rider approached under white flag. Ethan recognized him before the man came within rifle range. The posture, the way he sat his horse, the particular angle of his campaign hat. Sergeant William Hooks, looking older than 3 years should account for, his uniform dusty from hard riding. Ethan stepped into the open, his hand near his sidearm but not touching it. Nayeli positioned herself at the cabin corner where she could observe without being obvious target. Hooks dismounted 20 yards out and approached on foot, his hands visible and empty. "Been a long time, Corporal. Sorry, not Corporal anymore." The greeting carried awkwardness of old friends meeting across a chasm neither was certain could be bridged. Ethan kept his voice neutral. "What do you want, Will?" "To talk, as friends." "We're not friends, not anymore." Pain flickered across Hook's weathered face. "Because you deserted. Because you didn't." The accusation landed cleanly. Hooks absorbed it without argument, because they both knew the truth of it. He'd followed orders Ethan refused. He'd participated in the massacre Ethan had tried to prevent. The blood on his hands would never fully wash away regardless of how many years passed. "Fair enough, but I'm here anyway. With warning, you need to hear." "I'm listening." "Caldwell's coming. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe day after. 20 men. Hired guns mixed with former soldiers. He wants the Apache girl, but he wants you more." "Why?" "You made him look weak. Story of you refusing orders spread through ranks. Other men started questioning him. He lost command because of it. Got forced out same as you, but without the honor of standing for principle. Just incompetence and cruelty adding up until Army couldn't ignore it." Hooks took a step closer, lowering his voice. "He's got nothing now except bitterness and schemes to get rich off land that isn't his. Taking the chief's daughter gives him leverage. Getting revenge on you gives him satisfaction. He'll do both if he can." "Why are you telling me this?" The question hung between them, weighted with all the betrayal and brotherhood that had once bound them. Hooks met his eyes directly. "Because I've been following bad orders too long. Because I watched you lose everything standing up for what's right, and I did nothing. Because maybe it's not too late to make a different choice." "You're still wearing his uniform. For 3 more months, then my pension vests. If I disobey before that, you lose everything." Hooks nodded miserably. "So you came to warn me but won't actually help when it matters." "I didn't say that. I said I can't openly disobey. But there's space between following orders and helping him succeed." Nayeli emerged from her position then, moving to stand beside Ethan. Hooks saw her and something complicated crossed his face. Recognition of her humanity colliding with ingrained prejudices, military discipline warring with moral discomfort. "Ma'am, I apologize for the trouble coming your way." She studied him with the same intensity her father had shown Ethan, seeing past uniform to the man wearing it. "You are a soldier. You follow orders. But he," she gestured toward Ethan, "he chose different. That is why I trust him." The contrast wasn't subtle. Hooks flinched from it but didn't argue. He turned back to Ethan. 3 days. Caldwell arrives in 3 days. I'll be with him. I'll be in uniform. But I'll also be looking for ways to even the odds without getting myself court-martialed. That's all I can ask." Hooks mounted his horse but paused before leaving. "Ethan, if you somehow survive this, if you manage to stop him, there's going to be hell to pay after. You know that?" "I know. And you're doing it anyway. What else can I do? Run? Let her be taken? Let Caldwell steal more land and hurt more people?" Hooks shook his head slowly. "You haven't changed at all. Still the same stubborn bastard who'd rather die right than live wrong. That's supposed to be an insult? I genuinely don't know anymore." He rode away, leaving Ethan and Nayeli standing in the yard as the sun sank toward the horizon. She spoke first. "Your friend is coward. My friend is scared. There's a difference. You think he will help? I think he wants to. Whether he actually will when the moment comes, that I can't answer." She considered this, then nodded slowly. Fear makes men do strange things. Sometimes it makes them heroes. Sometimes it makes them empty. Which one do you think he'll be? I think he will decide when bullets fly. Not before is not choice that can be made in safety. Her wisdom caught him off guard the way it often did, her observations cutting through complexity to core truths he'd been circling without naming. He turned to face her fully. You should leave. Go back to your people. Let me face this alone. No, Niley, he's coming with 20 men. I can't win that fight. Best I can do is make them pay for taking you. But if you're not here, then what? He comes anyway. He brings his army anyway. Only difference is you die alone instead of with someone fighting beside you. At least you'd be safe. She stepped closer, her height bringing them nearly eye to eye, her expression fierce with determination that wouldn't be argued away. I am daughter of chief. I am warrior. I have faced death before. I do not run from it now just because odds are bad. This isn't your fight. You made it my fight when you saved me, when you stood with me against Father's test, when you chose to protect me instead of staying safe. You think I abandon you now? Her hand came up to rest against his chest the way it had repeatedly since she'd first touched him there, over his heart, checking for steadiness, for certainty, for the qualities she'd been measuring since she opened her eyes and found him kneeling beside her in the desert. We stand together. We fight together. We survive together or we fall together. This is way it is. Something in his chest cracked then, not breaking but opening, making space for the possibility that he didn't have to face everything alone anymore. That partnership might be real, that someone might actually choose to stand beside him, knowing full well the cost of that choice. He covered her hand with his own, feeling her heartbeat through her palm, matching the rhythm of his own pulse to hers. Together then. Together. The moment held, charged with everything they weren't saying, loaded with possibilities neither was ready to fully acknowledge. Then Niley stepped back, breaking the spell but not the connection. Now we prepare. 3 days is not much time, but is enough if we use it right. They spent the remaining daylight fortifying the cabin and planning defensive positions. Niley's tactical knowledge proved invaluable, her understanding of guerrilla warfare complementing his training in conventional defense. Together they created something that might, with luck and skill, give them chance against odds that any reasonable person would consider insurmountable. As night fell, they sat again on the porch, this time with purpose replacing the contemplative silence of previous evenings. They reviewed their plans, identified weaknesses, adjusted strategies. But underneath the practical discussion ran currents neither acknowledged aloud. Awareness of each other's proximity, attention that lingered longer than necessary, touches that came more frequently than required by coordination alone. Near midnight, Nayeli stood to go inside. At the threshold, she turned back. Ethan, yeah? Thank you for not sending me away. You wouldn't have gone anyway. She smiled, rare and genuine. No, but thank you for not trying harder. She disappeared inside, leaving him to the darkness in his thoughts and the knowledge that 3 days from now, everything would change one way or another. He touched the place on his chest where her hand had rested, feeling phantom warmth still radiating there. Wondering when exactly she'd stop being a stranger he saved and become someone he couldn't imagine losing. The desert wind picked up, carrying sounds from far away. Coyotes and nightbirds, and the whisper of sand moving across stone. Somewhere out there, Caldwell was coming with his army and his grievances. Somewhere closer, Hooks wrestled with his conscience. Somewhere in the darkness, Keem watched from his camp, reporting back to Dakota that his daughter had chosen a white man who'd lost everything standing for principle. And here, on this porch, Ethan Cross accepted that the careful isolation he'd built was gone forever, replaced by connection that terrified him precisely because it mattered so much. 7 days the test had demanded. They were halfway through with no blood spilled yet, but blood was coming. That much was certain. Whether they survived it to see what happened on the 8th day remained question that only violence would answer. He checked his weapons one final time, settled into the chair that had become his watch post, and waited for dawn to bring them one day closer to the moment when all their planning would either save them or prove insufficient against hate that had festered 3 years and wanted satisfaction more than justice. Dawn broke on the seventh day, with the color of old blood spreading across the horizon. Ethan stood on the ridge overlooking the canyon entrance, his rifle loaded and ready, watching dust clouds form in the distance. The promised 3 days had passed. Caldwell was coming. Nayeli crouched beside him, her injuries fully healed now, moving with the fluid certainty of a warrior who'd found her strength again. She'd painted 2 lines of ash across her cheekbones, the way Apache fighters did before battle. Not decoration, declaration. 20 men, she said quietly, counting the dust trails. Maybe more. 23. Ethan's military training read the patterns automatically. 4 scouts ahead, main force behind, 2 flanking positions. Caldwell is not fool. No, but he's angry. Angry men make mistakes. They'd chosen this ground carefully over the past 3 days. The canyon entrance created a natural bottleneck, forcing any approaching force into a killing field where numbers mattered less than position. Keem and 3 Apache warriors held the northern ridge. Dakota had sent them despite his promise not to interfere. Protecting his daughter trumped custom. Ethan had argued against it initially, but Nayeli had been firm. This is not just your fight anymore. You made it ours when you stood for us. We stand for you. The sound of hoofbeats echoed off canyon walls as Caldwell's force came into view. The colonel rode at the front, his posture military straight despite the whiskey that had ravaged him. Behind him rode a mix of hard men, former soldiers who'd found civilian life disappointing, drifters who killed for pay, a few faces Ethan recognized from Fort Bowie who'd followed Caldwell into disgrace rather than face their own consciences. Hooks rode near the back, his face carefully neutral, playing his part. Caldwell raised his hand. The column stopped 100 yards out, just beyond effective rifle range. Smart. He was assessing the terrain, looking for the trap he knew had to be waiting. His eyes swept the ridgeline until they found Ethan standing in clear view. Cross! His voice carried across the distance. Parade ground trained. I'm offering you one chance. Send out the girl. Walk away. I'll let you live. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, let Caldwell feel the weight of it. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the same calm authority it had when refusing orders 3 years ago. Can't do that, Colonel. Then you're a fool. I've got 20 men. You've got what? You and a wounded savage? Nayeli stood then, deliberately, making sure Caldwell could see her clearly. She raised her rifle and fired once. The shot kicked up dirt 3 feet in front of Caldwell's horse, precise enough to show skill, close enough to make the animal shy. Wounded savage says hello, she called out, her English crisp. Caldwell's face darkened. He gestured to his men. Anyone who brings me that woman alive gets double pay. The deserter you can kill. The flanking forces began moving, trying to circle around to the ridgelines. Ethan had anticipated this. He raised his hand, and Keem's warriors opened fire from concealed positions, not trying to kill, but to pin them down and funnel them toward the center. The tactics worked. Caldwell's men pulled back into the canyon mouth, exactly where Ethan wanted them. You trained them well, Cross, Caldwell shouted. But you're still outnumbered. This ends one way. Then let's end it, Ethan called back. You and me, like it should have been 3 years ago. Hand to hand. Your men stand down. My people stand down. We settle this ourselves. He saw Caldwell hesitate, saw the calculation behind the colonel's eyes, pride warring with practicality, the men watching, waiting to see if their leader was man enough to accept. Why should I? I've got the numbers. Because you want this personal. Because killing me through hired guns doesn't satisfy what you really need. You want to beat me yourself, prove you were right and I was wrong. The truth of it hung in the desert air. Caldwell had been obsessing over this confrontation for 3 years. The chance to physically dominate the man who'd embarrassed him, who'd cost him his career, who'd proven that refusing evil was possible. It was too tempting to resist. Fine, but when I win, my men take the girl. When I win, you leave. All of you. And this ends. Caldwell dismounted. So did Ethan. They walked toward each other, meeting in the open ground between their forces. Ethan handed his rifle to Nayeli. Caldwell gave his to Hooks. Both men wore sidearms, but some unspoken agreement kept hands away from gun belts. This would be settled with fists. They circled each other slowly. Two men trained in the same brutal methods of close combat the Army drilled into soldiers who might need to kill silently. Caldwell was older, heavier, weakened by drink. But rage was fuel, and he'd been burning it hot for years. He came in fast, telegraphing the punch too obviously. Ethan slipped it and countered with a body shot that landed solidly. Caldwell grunted but didn't slow. He tackled Ethan, driving him backward into the dirt. They grappled, rolling across the ground, each trying to gain position. Caldwell got on top, started raining punches. Ethan blocked most, but several connected. Jaw, temple, ribs. The pain focused him. He bucked, twisted, reversed their positions. Now he had the advantage. He hit Caldwell twice, hard shots that split the colonel's lip and opened a cut above his eye. Yield! Never! They broke apart, both climbing to their feet. Blood dripped from Caldwell's face. Ethan's ribs screamed where old injuries had cracked again. They crashed together once more, trading blows with the mechanical efficiency of men who understood violence intimately. Minutes passed. Both were exhausted. Neither would quit. Then Ethan saw it, the nearly imperceptible shift in Caldwell's eyes. A signal. His blood went cold. The shot came from the northern ridge, not from Keem's position, but from somewhere higher. A sniper Caldwell had positioned earlier, probably during the night. The bullet was meant for Ethan's back. It never arrived. Nayli had seen the glint of sun on metal a second before the shooter fired. She moved like water, exactly as she'd taught Ethan. By the time the rifle cracked, she was already behind cover, and the sniper found himself facing 3 Apache warriors who'd circled behind his position. The brief struggle ended with him disarmed and unconscious. But Caldwell had seen his plan fail. Desperation replaced calculation. He pulled the knife from his boot and lunged. Ethan caught his wrist, barely. They struggled over the blade, faces inches apart. Caldwell's breath stank of whiskey and decay. His eyes held nothing but hate. You destroyed everything. You destroyed yourself. I just refused to help. Ethan twisted hard. The knife fell. He swept Caldwell's legs and put him face down in the dirt, one knee pressed into his spine, his hand controlling the colonel's head. Yield. For a long moment, Caldwell struggled. Then his body went slack. The fight drained out of him, not because of physical defeat, but because something inside finally broke. He'd lost. Not just the fight, everything. I yield. Ethan released him and stepped back, breathing hard. Caldwell rolled onto his back and stared at the sky, his face empty. That's when Caldwell's hired guns made their move. The one-eyed mercenary near the front raised his rifle toward Nayeli. 3 others followed his lead. They'd been paid to capture her, and they didn't care about honor or duels or any of the rules their employer had agreed to. Hell with this. We're taking the squaw. Hooks moved before anyone else could react. He stepped in front of the mercenary's rifle and spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. No. Get out of the way, Sergeant. I'm done taking orders that aren't lawful. This is over. Colonel lost fair. We're leaving. You ain't my commander. No, but I'm the only one here with legal authority. Hook's voice hardened. I'm also the only one who can verify in court that you followed orders versus committed murder and kidnapping. Your choice how this gets reported. Several of Caldwell's former soldiers began lowering their weapons. They understood the calculation. Whatever they'd been promised wasn't worth hanging for. The mercenaries looked at each other, weighing odds. 4 of them against 1 sergeant didn't seem bad until they noticed Kem and his warriors had better positions now, rifles trained and ready. The one-eyed mercenary spat. This ain't worth it. We weren't paid enough to die. They began mounting up, slow and sullen. Ethan watched carefully, ready for treachery, but the moment had passed. They were just men now. Not soldiers, not a unit. Just individuals deciding that survival beat money. Hooks walked to Caldwell and stood over him. Get up, sir. Caldwell struggled to his feet, his face a mask of dried blood and dirt in broken pride. He looked at Ethan one last time. We could have been great, you and me. We could have built something. We would have built it on bones, Colonel. That's not greatness. That's just a graveyard. Caldwell had no answer for that. Hooks helped him onto his horse. The column began withdrawing, leaving only dust and the memory of violence that hadn't quite erupted into slaughter. When they were out of sight, Ethan's legs nearly gave out. Nayely was there instantly, supporting him. He leaned on her harder than he'd ever admit needing to. "You're hurt. Cracked ribs. Same ones from before. I'll live. You fought well. We fought well." She smiled at that, fierce and proud. Kimi approached, his warriors fanning out to make sure Caldwell's men were truly leaving. "Your friend Hooks. He made choice." "Yeah, he did. Good choice. Maybe there is hope for some white soldiers after all." Dakota appeared then, having watched from a concealed position. He looked at Ethan with something that might have been respect, or might have been resignation that his daughter had chosen correctly. 7 days are complete. You protected her. You fought with honor. You brought warriors together instead of driving them apart. He paused. The bond is recognized. You are family now. Ethan started to respond, but Dakota held up a hand. "This does not make you Apache. This does not erase what was done to our people. This makes you bridge. Bridges are uncomfortable places. You stand between worlds. That is hard path." "I know. Good. Then walk it well." Dakota and his warriors departed, leaving Ethan and Nayeli alone in the canyon as the sun climbed higher. She helped him sit, checking his injuries with practiced hands. "Ribs are broken again. You need rest." "Can't rest yet. Caldwell might come back." "No, he will not." Her voice carried certainty. "You broke more than his body. You broke his reason for fighting. He has nothing left now." She was right. Ethan had seen it in Caldwell's eyes at the end. The colonel had built his entire identity around being right, being strong, being the man who made hard choices others couldn't stomach. Losing the fight, needing to be helped onto his horse by a subordinate who'd betrayed him, riding away while the deserter stood victorious, it had shattered whatever held him together. "What do we do now?" Nayeli looked at him, the warrior woman who'd been dying in the desert when he found her, who'd become his partner in building something that might outlast them both. "Now we go home. We heal. We build. And when they bring him to trial, we testify. We make sure this ends properly. Together? Always together." She helped him to his feet. The walk back to the cabin was slow and painful, but neither hurried. They'd survived. They'd won. The threat that had hung over them was gone, or at least transformed into something manageable through official channels rather than violence. Behind them, the canyon stood empty except for bloodstains in the dirt that would fade with the next rain. Ahead lay the life they'd been building, fragile and impossible and real. The battle was over. The harder work of peace was just beginning. The weeks that followed the standoff at the canyon entrance moved with the peculiar slowness of time spent waiting for wounds to finish healing and consequences to fully reveal themselves. Victory carried prices beyond the obvious. The bruising around his eye had faded from purple to yellow-green, stages of damage repairing itself the way bodies did when given time and reason. Nayeli had resumed full movement within days, her warrior conditioning accelerating recovery in ways that made his own healing feel sluggish by comparison. She moved through the cabin and yard with fluid purpose, helping rebuild what the brief siege had damaged, teaching him Apache methods for fortifying structures without making them look fortified. They worked side by side in comfortable silence that occasionally broke into conversation about practical matters. How deep to set posts, which direction the prevailing winds came from, whether the well-needed maintenance before winter arrived. Lieutenant Morrison had kept his word about filing reports and gathering evidence. The military investigation into Caldwell's activities had moved with surprising speed once testimonies from Hooks and several other soldiers established patterns of corruption extending beyond this single incident. Land schemes, falsified reports, attacks on peaceful settlements blamed on hostile actions that never occurred. The accumulated weight of it finally exceeded what the Army could ignore or excuse. The summons arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried by a young private who looked uncomfortable delivering official correspondence to a man with dishonorable discharge in his record. The trial would convene at Fort Apache in 2 weeks. Ethan's presence was requested as witness. Requested, not required, because he held no rank and owed the military nothing except the scars they'd given him. Nayeli watched him read the letter twice before speaking. "You will go?" I should. Hooks testified. Morrison built the case. Least I can do is stand up and tell what happened. You owe them nothing. They took your honor. Called you coward. Why help them now? He folded the paper carefully, thinking about that question and all the ways it mattered. Not helping them. Helping everyone Caldwell would hurt if he gets away with this. Stopping him matters more than my pride. She considered this, then nodded slowly. Then we go together. You don't have to. We agreed. Together. Or did you forget already? The gentle challenge in her voice reminded him that they'd crossed some threshold during those 3 days preparing for battle. Something had shifted from alliance of necessity into partnership of choice. She'd decided that where he went, she went. Not from obligation, from want. Fort Apache sprawled across the desert exactly as Ethan remembered it, though his perspective had changed enough that the place felt simultaneously familiar and alien. The parade ground where he'd once drilled, the administrative buildings where his court-martial had been held, the stockade where they'd kept him before discharging him with papers that ensured every door would close when he approached. Walking through the gates wearing civilian clothes while soldiers saluted officers and went about the business of military life hit harder than expected. He'd loved this life once, believed in its purpose and structure, found meaning and service that transcended individual wants. The betrayal hadn't been the army turning on him. The betrayal had been discovering that the institution he'd served would protect men like Caldwell while discarding men like him. The courtroom filled quickly. Officers comprising the panel sat at the front, their faces arranged in expressions of professional neutrality that suggested they'd already reached conclusions and were going through required motions. Caldwell sat at the defendant's table, flanked by lawyers who looked expensive and confident. He'd aged badly in the weeks since their fight, his face carrying the gray pallor of a man who'd lost his purpose and couldn't find replacement except in bottles. When Caldwell's eyes found Ethan across the room, something flickered there. Hatred, certainly, but underneath it something that looked almost like relief. As if finally facing consequences was easier than running from them, as if having someone to blame was simpler than accepting responsibility. Hooks testified first, his voice steady as he described participating in actions he'd known were wrong, following orders from a superior he'd feared more than respected. The lawyers attacked his credibility and his timing, suggesting convenient testimony from a man trying to secure his pension by betraying his commander. But Hooks didn't break. He sat straight in his witness chair and answered every question with specificity that came from living with guilt 3 years and finally finding opportunity to transform it into something resembling atonement. Morrison followed, presenting documentation that painted damning picture. Falsified reports claiming Apache attacks that never happened. Land surveys that coincidentally discovered valuable mineral deposits on territory designated for tribal use. Payments to raiders who'd somehow known exactly where to strike for maximum political impact. The accumulated evidence built structure too solid for reasonable doubt to penetrate. When they called Ethan to testify, he felt Naomi's hand squeeze his briefly before he stood. She'd taken a seat in the back where Apache observers were allowed, separated from white spectators by invisible lines that everyone acknowledged and nobody questioned. Her presence steadied him as he walked to the front and placed his hand on the Bible they provided for oath-taking. The prosecutor began gently, establishing who Ethan was, his service record before Fort Apache, his reputation as reliable soldier and leader. Then came the questions about that day. What he'd seen, what orders he'd received, why he'd refused. The story emerged in clinical detail, his voice never wavering even as he described moments that still visited his dreams. Caldwell's attorney approached the cross-examination like a man who knew his client was guilty but had obligation to mount defense anyway. He focused on Ethan's discharge, his admitted disobedience, his lack of authority to question superior officers' judgment, each question designed to paint him as unreliable witness motivated by personal vendetta. You hold Colonel Caldwell responsible for your discharge. No, I hold myself responsible. I made the choice. I accepted the consequences. But you resent him. Ethan met the lawyer's eyes directly. I resent what he did to innocent people. My feelings about what happened to me are separate. You deserted your post, abandoned your brothers in arms, violated sacred trust between soldiers. I refuse to participate in massacre. If that's desertion, then yes, I'm guilty. But I'd make the same choice tomorrow. The lawyer tried several more angles, but each one revealed the same core. Ethan believed he'd done right thing, and no amount of legal maneuvering would make him recant. Eventually, the cross-examination ended, and he was dismissed. The verdict came 2 days later. Guilty on 17 counts including conduct, unbecoming an officer, misuse of military resources, and fraudulent claims against government interests. Cashiered from service with loss of pension and possibility of additional criminal charges pending review by civilian authorities. Caldwell received the judgment without visible reaction, his face empty of everything except exhaustion. Outside the courtroom, Hooks found Ethan in the dusty space between buildings, where soldiers gathered to smoke and complain. "Thank you for testifying. You took the real risk. I just confirmed what you'd already said. Still, couldn't have done it without knowing someone else would stand up too." They shook hands, that gesture carrying weight of shared history and divergent choices finally reconciling into mutual respect. Hooks had 3 months left in uniform and plans to take a marshal's position in one of the growing territorial towns. Ethan had a cabin in the desert and a woman who'd chosen to stand beside him against long odds. Different paths, both earned through pain. Morrison approached as Hooks left, his young face showing satisfaction of a man who'd accomplished difficult thing for right reasons. "There's talk about investigating other incidents. What happened here exposed patterns. Could be multiple cases reopened." "That's good. People deserve accountability." They're also discussing reparations for the Fort Apache massacre, for other attacks on peaceful settlements. Won't bring anyone back, but might provide resources for rebuilding. Ethan nodded slowly, thinking about Dakota and the people who'd lost so much to policies that claimed civilization while delivering only violence. "I'll make sure the chief knows. He can decide if accepting government money is worth dealing with government bureaucracy." Morrison hesitated, then spoke more carefully. "You know there's process for appealing discharge decisions. With Caldwell's conviction, with the evidence that's come out, you might be able to get your discharge upgraded, restore your rank, clear your record." The offer hung between them, tempting in its simplicity. One petition, one review. Everything he'd lost potentially restored. But even as he considered it, he knew the answer. "Appreciate the thought, but I don't want it back." "You sure? You were a good soldier. Could have gone far." "I was a soldier who followed orders I shouldn't have followed until I finally refused one I couldn't live with. That's not good soldier. That's someone who took too long to find his conscience. That's harsh judgment. That's accurate judgment. I made peace with who I was and who I became. Don't need the Army's forgiveness to sleep at night." Morrison accepted this with nod that suggested respect, even if he didn't fully understand. They parted with handshake and promises to stay in touch that both men knew they probably wouldn't keep because their lives pointed different directions now. Nayli waited outside the fort's gates, having refused to spend more time than necessary within walls that represented everything her people had suffered. When Ethan emerged, she fell into step beside him, their shoulders nearly touching as they walked toward the horses they'd left with local stable. "It is finished?" "This part is." "Good, now we go home." The word landed with weight neither acknowledged directly. Home, not his home, not her people's territory, just home. A place they'd built together from isolation and necessity that had somehow transformed into something neither wanted to leave. The ride back took 3 days, and during that time they talked more than they had since her arrival. About futures that seemed possible now that immediate dangers had passed. About what came next for her people, and whether integration was realistic or just pretty idea that would crumble under pressure of prejudice and fear. About whether a white man and Apache woman building life together could represent bridge between worlds or just made them targets for hatred from both sides. They returned to find the cabin undisturbed, but the surrounding territory changed. New settlers had arrived during their absence, staking claims on land that had previously been empty. 3 families had established homesteads within 5 miles, drawn by government promises of cheap land and new opportunities. Their arrival shifted the balance, transforming isolation into proximity that carried both promise and threat. Dakota called council the following week. Ethan attended at Nayeli's insistence, sitting among warriors who watched him with varying degrees of suspicion and acceptance. The debate centered on response to encroachment. Some argued for resistance before the trickle of settlers became flood. Others counseled adaptation, learning to trade and coexist rather than fighting losing battle against inevitable changes. Dakota let the arguments run their course before speaking, his voice carrying authority that silenced others immediately. We have fought. We have lost more than we gained. The question is not whether white people come. They come. The question is whether we meet them as enemies or as people who also need to live on this land. One of the younger warriors stood, his voice sharp with frustration. They take and take. They push us smaller and smaller. When do we say enough? We say enough when we are strong enough to make them hear. Right now, we are not strong enough. Not for the war you want. But maybe we are strong enough for different kind of fight. Dakota's gaze moved to Ethan. You are bridge between my daughter's world and your world. What does Bridge see? The question put him on spot, asking him to speak for experiences he didn't fully own. He stood aware of every eye tracking him. I see people afraid, on both sides. Settlers fear you because they've heard stories. Your people fear them because you've lived those stories. Fear makes everyone stupid. Some warriors shifted uncomfortably. Dakota gestured for him to continue. You asked what I see. I see that fighting confirms fear, proves to settlers that you're dangerous, proves to you that they're enemies. But if there was a way to show each other as human first, maybe fear loses power. And how do we show this? By surrendering? By pretending our deaths don't matter? By building something that can't be ignored? Something that proves integration benefits everyone? Something that makes destroying you mean destroying something valuable to them too? The idea that emerged from that discussion surprised everyone, including him. A school, open to both Apache and settler children, teaching both languages and cultures. Creating next generation that understood both worlds. It was audacious, probably impossible, likely to be attacked by extremists on both sides. But it was also something tangible that could be built and defended and pointed to as evidence that different way was possible. Niley supported the plan immediately, volunteering to teach and organize. Kim agreed to help with construction. Several settlers expressed cautious interest when approached carefully. Even the local minister, a pragmatic man more concerned with souls than politics, offered his blessing and promised to encourage his congregation to give the project chance. The building site chosen was neutral ground between Ethan's property and the nearest Apache camp. Close enough to both communities for easy access, but not so close to either that it seemed claimed by one side. They began work in early autumn when temperatures had dropped enough to make physical labor bearable. Ethan had expected resistance. What he hadn't expected was how quickly community formed around shared purpose. Apache men and settler families working side by side, learning each other's methods, sharing tools and techniques, children playing together while adults built structure that would house their education. Moments of friction occurred. Prejudices didn't disappear overnight. But when conflicts arose, people worked through them because the alternative meant abandoning something they'd all invested in. Nayeli moved between groups with the confidence of someone completely comfortable in her authority. She directed construction, mediated disputes, taught impromptu lessons to children who gathered to watch. Ethan saw her truly in her element for first time, leading rather than recovering, strong rather than wounded. She was magnificent. Late one afternoon, she found him taking a break in the shade, wiping sweat from his face with a cloth that had been cleaned that morning. You are thinking too loud. I can hear it from across the yard. Just watching, wondering if this will actually work. She settled beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. Physical proximity had become natural between them, neither pulling away from casual contact that a few months earlier would have felt impossible. You remember when you asked if I was happy? You said happy was large word. I remember what I said. I have been thinking about it since, wondering if happy was right measure. What's the right measure? She was quiet for a moment, watching children chase each other around building that was slowly taking shape. Purpose. Purpose is right measure. I have purpose now. Not just surviving, Not just fighting, building something that lasts after I am gone. That is better than happy. He understood exactly what she meant. They'd both been running, from violence, from guilt, from futures that felt predetermined by pasts they couldn't change. This school represented choice to create something new instead of just enduring what was given. I love you. The words escaped before he'd consciously decided to speak them. They hung in the dusty air between them, simple and terrifying in their honesty. Nellie turned to look at him fully, her expression impossible to read. You love me. Yes. You are certain? This is not just, she gestured vaguely at the building site, not just feeling good about project we build? I'm certain. I love you. Have for a while now. Just took me time to understand that's what it was. She studied his face with the intensity she brought to everything, searching for doubt or hesitation, or the lies men told when they wanted something and believed pretty words were currency that could purchase it. She found none of those things. I do not know this feeling well. I know respect. I know trust. I know wanting to be near you. Is that love? I think so. I think that's exactly what it is. She leaned against him, her head finding his shoulder, her hands settling over his heart where it had rested so many times before. Then I think I love you too, even if I do not have good words for it yet. They sat together as the sun dropped toward the horizon and the building crew began packing tools for the day. Around them, a community was forming that neither could have predicted months earlier when he found her dying in the desert. They'd become the bridge Dakota had named them. Not perfect, not without complications, but real and solid and getting stronger with each day they chose to keep building. The attack came on a Tuesday night 3 weeks later. Ethan woke to the smell of smoke and the sound of glass breaking. He rolled from bed with rifle already in hand, moving toward the window by instinct while his mind caught up to consciousness. The school was burning. Flames climbed the walls they'd spent weeks constructing, consuming lumber and dreams with equal appetite. Nayeli appeared beside him, fully dressed despite the hour, knife in hand. How many? Can't tell. At least 3, maybe more. They moved together through the door, approaching the fire with weapons ready and senses stretched toward detecting threats in the darkness beyond the flames. 3 figures became visible, silhouetted against the blaze, laughing as they watched their handiwork, drunk based on how they staggered, armed based on the rifles slung over their shoulders. Ethan approached from their blind side, his voice cutting through their celebration. You need to leave. Now. They spun, fumbling for weapons, surprise sobering them faster than coffee. The largest one, a settler Ethan recognized from the general store, a man who'd made clear his contempt for Apache, steadied himself and pointed his rifle. Or what? You'll shoot us for cleaning up vermin? I'll arrest you for arson and vandalism. Then I'll testify at your trial. You got no authority. You're just a deserter living with a savage. Nayeli appeared then from the other direction, her arrival forcing them to split attention. She moved like shadow, silent and deadly, positioning herself where she could strike before they could bring weapons fully to bear. Leave now, while you still can walk away. Something in her voice promised violence in ways that transcended threat. These men were drunk, but not stupid. They saw the calculation in her eyes and understood they'd made mistake coming here. But pride in whiskey made retreat difficult even when survival demanded it. The large man tried compromise. We was just teaching a lesson. Can't have whites and Indians mixing. It's not natural. What's not natural is burning down schools. What's not natural is attacking something that hurts nobody. What's not natural is being so afraid of change that you destroy it before you even understand it. Ethan's voice remained level, but something in his stillness suggested he was done talking and ready for action. Nayeli shifted slightly, her body language screaming readiness to cut them down. The 3 men exchanged glances, and whatever they saw in each other's faces told them they'd lost this confrontation. We're going, but this isn't over. More folks feel like we do than you think. They retreated into darkness, leaving Ethan and Nayeli to watch the school burn. The structure was too far gone to save. They could only stand witness as weeks of work transformed into ash and char. Other people arrived, Kim from the Apache camp, several settler families who'd helped with construction, the minister wringing his hands and muttering prayers. In the morning, they gathered to survey the damage. 3 walls had collapsed. The roof was gone. Months of labor reduced to smoking ruins. Some of the settlers talked about giving up, accepting that the experiment had failed. The minister suggested perhaps they'd pushed too hard too fast and should step back, give people time to adjust. Nayeli stood in the center of the destruction, her face set with determination that would not be argued with. We rebuild. Nayeli, maybe we should. We rebuild. Higher, stronger. They burn it because it matters, because they fear it. We do not let fear win. Ethan moved to stand beside her, understanding flowing between them without words needing to pass. This was exactly what they talked about. Purpose. Building something that lasted. Not quitting when things got hard. She's right. We rebuild. Kime joined them, crossing his arms over his chest. I will bring more warriors. We will guard while building. Let them try to burn it again. The minister surprised everyone by stepping forward too. I'll talk to my congregation. Remind them that Jesus said, love thy neighbor. Didn't specify which neighbors counted. One by one, the others committed to continuing. Not everyone. Some families decided the project was too dangerous, the divisions too deep, the risk not worth the reward. But enough remained, enough to rebuild, enough to prove that hatred could burn wood, but not purpose. They worked faster the second time, driven by anger and determination and the desire to show that violence wouldn't win. Apache warriors took shifts guarding the site. Settler men worked alongside them, and while tensions remained high, nobody could deny the effectiveness of their coordination. Within 6 weeks, they'd rebuilt what had taken months the first time, stronger and larger than before. The school opened in January to 30 students, 18 Apache, 12 settler children. Nayeli taught languages and traditions. A settler woman who'd been teacher back east taught reading and arithmetic. The minister led occasional discussions about morality and ethics that carefully avoided denominational specifics. It wasn't perfect. Parents pulled children over disagreements about curriculum. Some students struggled with language barriers. Cultural misunderstandings created friction. But it worked. Slowly, imperfectly, messily, it worked. Children learned. Friendships formed. Parents who'd been enemies found themselves standing together at school events. And while that didn't make them friends, it made them something other than adversaries. The bridge was real now, fragile, requiring constant maintenance, but real. The summons from Washington arrived in late winter, delivered by courier who looked exhausted from the journey. Congress was debating new Indian Relocation Act. Testimony was needed from people who could speak to successful integration. Lieutenant Morrison had submitted Ethan and Nayeli's names as witnesses. Would they be willing to testify? The journey east took 3 weeks by train. That modern marvel of steel and steam that ate distance while making Nayeli simultaneously fascinated and uncomfortable. Cities overwhelmed her. The noise and crowds and sheer density of humanity pressed against senses evolved for open spaces in scattered populations. Ethan stayed close, his presence anchor that kept her from bolting back toward territory she understood. Washington, D.C. sprawled with deliberate grandeur, buildings designed to inspire awe and communicate power. The Capitol building dominated the skyline, its dome visible from miles away. They arrived the day before their scheduled testimony, checking into a modest hotel that Morrison had arranged. Lawyers met with them that evening, coaching them on what to expect, which questions to anticipate, how to respond effectively. Be respectful but honest. Don't let them bully you. Don't lose your temper. Remember, you're representing possibility, not arguing policy. The hearing room felt designed to intimidate. High ceilings, ornate decorations, rows of seats for spectators and press. The congressional committee sat elevated at the front, 15 men whose decisions would affect thousands of lives. Ethan approached the witness table with Nayeli beside him, both dressed in their best clothes, both carrying themselves with dignity that no setting could diminish. The questioning began formally, establishing their identities and backgrounds. Then came the substantive inquiry. Describe the school, explain how it functioned, provide evidence of success, address concerns about security and cultural dilution, and the practical challenges of integration. Ethan answered methodically, presenting facts and outcomes, avoiding emotional appeals because he understood these men responded to data more readily than sentiment. Enrollment numbers, attendance rates, incidents of conflict and how they'd been resolved. Economic benefits to both communities from increased cooperation. Then came hostile questions, senators who'd already decided integration was impossible and wanted witnesses who'd confirm their prejudices. But surely you acknowledge that eventually the Apache must fully assimilate, abandon their savage ways, become civilized. Ethan felt Nayeli tense beside him. He spoke before she could respond with the anger he heard building in her silence. Senator, I've lived among the Apache people. I've learned their methods for survival in an environment that would kill most of your constituents within days. Their ways aren't savage. They're adapted to context. What you call civilization is just different adaptation. Neither is inherently superior. You're defending paganism and barbarism. I'm defending people, human beings who deserve the same rights and respect you demand for yourself. The senator leaned forward, his voice dripping contempt. You're a deserter, a disgrace to your uniform. Why should this body listen to anything you say? Nayeli stood then, her movement sharp enough to draw every eye in the room. When she spoke, her English carried the precision of someone who'd learned the language specifically to be understood by people like the senator. You ask why listen to him? I tell you why. Because he refused order to kill my people when it would have been easier to follow. Because he lost everything standing for what is right. Because he builds instead of destroys. Because he sees us as human when men like you see us as problem to be solved. She planted her hands on the table, leaning toward the committee. I am Apache. I am also American because this land was my ancestors before it was yours. You say we must choose? Why? You do not ask other Americans to forget where they come from. Only us. Only the ones who were here first. Her voice rose, passion breaking through the careful control she'd maintained. We have tried war. We lost. Now we try peace. We build schools. We teach children. We trade with neighbors. We prove we can live together. And still you push us away. Still you say we are not good enough, not civilized enough, not white enough. She straightened, her gaze sweeping across all 15 senators. Question is not whether we can learn your ways. Question is whether you can accept us learning them while keeping our own. Because we are still here. We are still people. And we will remain, one way or another. You decide, do we remain in peace or in graves? The chamber fell silent. Even the hostile senators seemed caught off guard by her directness, her refusal to soften edges or beg for acceptance. She laid out the choice with clarity that made evasion impossible. The committee could support integration or continue policies that guaranteed conflict, but they couldn't pretend there was neutral ground. An older senator in the center stood, his weathered face suggesting he'd seen more than he wanted of war's costs. Ma'am, I fought Indians for 10 years, lost friends to Apache warriors, believed you were savages who couldn't be reasoned with. He paused, his next words coming slower. But I listened to you speak. I hear what you built. And I think maybe I was wrong. Not wrong to fight when I did. Wrong to keep fighting after the fighting should have ended. He turned to address his fellow senators. Maybe it's time we acknowledge that manifest destiny doesn't have to mean extermination. Maybe it means making room, finding way to expand without erasing. These two people prove it's possible. Not easy, not perfect, but possible. The vote came 3 days later. The Relocation Act was defeated by 4 votes. Narrow margin, temporary victory, but victory nonetheless. Tribes would remain on their ancestral lands, at least for now. The school could continue. The experiment could proceed. Outside the capital, Ethan and Nayeli stood in winter sunshine that felt nothing like the desert sun they knew. The city bustled around them, indifferent to the small victory they'd helped secure. Nayeli turned to him, exhaustion and satisfaction mixing in her expression. We did it. For now. You are never satisfied. Would you love me if I was? She smiled, rare and genuine. Probably not. I need someone stubborn as me. They returned west to find the school thriving in their absence, the community that had formed around it growing stronger. More families had arrived during winter, drawn by stories of successful integration. The settlement was expanding. the lines between Apache and settler territory blurring as trade and cooperation made rigid boundaries irrelevant. Spring brought renewed building. The school needed expansion to accommodate increased enrollment. Several families proposed joint construction of small trading posts that would serve both communities. Cam and two settler men started planning irrigation project to improve farming in the arid terrain. The bridge they'd talked about was becoming real infrastructure connecting people who would have been enemies in different circumstances. Ethan and Niallie's relationship deepened with the same patient inevitability as seasonal changes. They'd moved past the initial crisis that brought them together into something steadier and more complex. They argued about everything from construction techniques to teaching methods to how much wood the stove needed. They laughed more often than either expected. They built routines around each other's rhythms, learning which silences were comfortable and which needed breaking. One evening, as they sat on their porch watching sunset paint the desert in shades of amber, she spoke suddenly. "I want child." He nearly dropped his coffee. "You want what?" "Child. I want to have child. With you." The declaration landed like something physical. He set his cup down carefully, buying time to process what she'd just announced. That's a big decision. I know, but I'm not getting younger. And I want to build future, not just survive present. Child is future. But everything we've built is so fragile. What if it falls apart? What kind of world would we be bringing a child into? She took his hand, her grip firm and certain. Same world every child is born into. Uncertain, dangerous, beautiful. We cannot wait for perfect time. There is no perfect time. He thought about that, about Daniel and the future his brother had tried to secure for him, about Dakota's grandchildren learning both Apache and English in a schoolhouse built by people from different worlds, about the possibility that a child who was both Apache and white might represent something neither culture alone could produce. Okay, 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 let's have a child. Her smile transformed her face, and he realized he'd do almost anything to see that expression more often. They sat together as darkness claimed the sky, holding hands and imagining futures that had seemed impossible months earlier when he found her dying in the desert. 2 years passed in the way time does when life fills with purpose larger than individual survival. The school had grown to house 50 students. The trading post operated year-round. The irrigation project had transformed marginal land into productive farms that fed both communities. Conflicts still erupted. Old prejudices didn't disappear overnight. But mechanisms existed now for resolving disputes without violence. Ethan and Niallie's son turned one in the spring, a child who learned Apache from his mother and English from his father and existed as living bridge between worlds. They named him Daniel, honoring the brother whose sacrifice had made everything after possible. He had Niallie's dark eyes and Ethan's stubborn jaw, and when he cried, both parents heard echoes of futures demanding to be born. On the morning of Daniel's first birthday, Ethan walked alone to the grave marker he'd carved years earlier. The wood had weathered but held, testament to craftsmanship that had learned endurance. He stood in silence for several minutes, then spoke to the brother, who couldn't hear, but whose presence remained real in ways that transcended death. "I made it, Danny. Took a while. Made mistakes. But I made it. Found what you wanted for me. Peace, purpose, family." The wind answered, carrying sounds from the settlement where celebrations were preparing. His family waited. His community needed him. His future demanded attention. But this moment belonged to past that had made everything else possible. "Thank you for believing I could, even when I didn't." He turned and walked back toward the cabin where Niallie waited with their son. She stood on the porch, the child in her arms, both watching him return. His family, his home, his second chance at a life worth living. The desert had tested him with fire and blood and choices that cost everything while saving the only things that mattered. The bridge they'd built wasn't perfect, would never be perfect, but it was real and growing stronger, and sometimes that was enough. Sometimes surviving wasn't the victory. Building something that lasted beyond survival was the victory. Creating space for next generation to inherit something better than what came before was the victory. Ethan Cross had been a soldier, then a deserter, Then a man who learned that the hardest battles aren't fought with weapons, but with the courage to stand and build and believe that tomorrow might be better than yesterday if you're willing to work for it. He'd found redemption not through grand gestures, but through daily choices to show up, to help, to stand with someone who'd honored him by choosing him back. He climbed the porch steps and took his son from Niley's arms, feeling the small weight of future pressing against his chest. The child grabbed his finger and held on tight, that grip representing trust that hadn't been earned yet, but would be proven through years of choices still to come. Behind them, the settlement spread across terrain that had been empty when he arrived. Ahead stretched years that would bring new challenges and old conflicts dressed in modern clothes. But for this moment, standing with his family while community he'd helped build celebrated life over death and hope over despair, Ethan Cross was exactly where he needed to be. Not running, not hiding, not alone. Just present in the life he'd almost missed and grateful beyond words that fate or luck or Daniel's final act of love had put him on that trail at sunset when Nayeli needed someone to see her. The bridge held. The foundation was solid. And whatever came next, they'd face it together the same way they'd faced everything since that first impossible moment when a dying woman opened her eyes and chose to trust a stranger who'd already failed everyone who'd ever needed him. Sometimes second chances came from the desert in forms you couldn't predict. Sometimes redemption arrived bloodied and broken, but alive enough to heal if you were willing to try. And sometimes, when you were very fortunate, the person you saved ended up saving you right back.